Hello, everyone. My name is Samina Iqbal. We are very thankful to Lenbachhaus Museum to provide us with this opportunity to share our research. It would be myself and then Dr. Zehra Jumabhoy, who is a UK-based art critic and art historian specializing in contemporary South Asian art. She was the Stephen and Alina Haynes Scholar at the Kotal Institute of Art, London, where she completed her doctorate on contemporary Indian art and nationalism, and she's currently an associate lecturer there. She is a guest curated an exhibition of Bombay Progressive Artists Group at the Asia Society Museum in New York, which opened in September 2018, called The Progressives Revolution: Modern Art for a New India. The show probed the progressives' contribution to ideas of a secular, syncretic, multi-religious version of national identity and modernism. Today, she will explain the group's relationship to the dynamics of modernism with a particular attention to South Asian politics and the idea of the so-called Muslim Pakistan. The way this whole conversation has been generated between me and Zehra is, and I should mention quickly that, my research is on modern art of Pakistan, and the way we shaped this conversation is that my argument is that Lahore Art Circle, which is a small collective from Pakistan, and Pakistan came into being in 1947, as a lot of our audience would know. I argue that Lahore Art Circle was modeled after Bombay Progressive, which Dr. Zehra is going to talk about. And what I do is, when Zehra finished her presentation, I would do a presentation of 15 to 20 minutes. And Zehra is with me on the screen. And we will be very happy to answer any questions after this talk has been heard and attended. And if you have any questions, we will be very happy to one day do a Zoom together. Right now, two of us are continents apart, and doing it through the Zoom. So hopefully, without many disasters or any hiccups, we will be successfully able to do a presentation that's comprehensible for people. So over to you, Zehra. Thank you.
Hi, thanks, Samina, or should I say Dr. Samina. So as Samina mentioned, that this conversation is something that we've been developing, comparing modern Indian art with modern Pakistani art, more or less the same period that we're looking at. So this is the end of the 1940s and 50s is when these two collectives basically came together. And as I will show you, and then Samina will pick up on this, that in a way they were grappling with the same ideas of the modern, in some ways of the nation, as well as of how these two concepts interlinked or didn't interlink. And part of this whole conversation was the implicit awareness, sometimes explicit, but most often an implicit awareness of the other. And the reason that I say that is that as far as both of these groups went, they were founded just after Indian and Pakistani independence. They were founded based on a notion of, you had British colonialism, you had, in 1947, you had independence, but the independence coincided and actually was the result of a very bloody partition, where India broke, or where India and Pakistan split. And so at the very birth of the idea of these two nations was also a kind of a death, and in many cases very literal death, because it was a very bloody partition, as people crossed to the borders of a new India or a new Pakistan to sort of go to their new home. A lot of these migrants, they died, and it was also within this birth was the knowledge that there was a choice. It was a choice whether you were going to go across to the border of another nation or you were going to stay. And as far as the Bombay progressives were concerned, this group was founded in 1947, just after partition, and their first show was actually 2 years after they founded, so in 1949. But the thing to remember about this group is that if India was founded with the idea that it was going to be secular, and we'll discuss a little bit about this terminology of the secular, which means in this context multiracial, so Muslim, Christian, Hindu, then it was positing itself against a notion of Pakistan. And I'm not saying that this is an actual notion, because I'm sure Samina will deeply disagree with this whole idea of a kind of a Muslim Pakistan, which in any way the Lahore Art Circle is dealing with, and that's something she will pick up and sort of contest. But as far as these progressive artist group were concerned, that what they were planning in terms of building an iconography of the modern for India was that it was a secular India versus a Muslim Pakistan. And so when you see the build-up of the kind of images that we're going to get, it's a very deliberately syncretic, Hindu, Muslim, Christian kind of iconography that is being constructed because of this whole idea of the secular, of a secular India that they're kind of visualizing into being. And something that I'm gonna now just read out from start the presentation and share the screen with you. So, as Samina said, in September 2018, I curated an exhibition at the Asia Society Museum. This was in New York. And the brief for this show was really modern Indian art. It started with a very, very sort of, the brief at the beginning, I co-curated with the director of the museum. And when we first started working on this, the idea was that I would build from my PhD, which was around concepts of nationalism and India. And that it would sort of talk about some of the ideas of how it's possible to be have a concept of the nation that is at the same time inclusive. And when I first started working on the show, it was quite open as to what this concept of the modern could actually include. So my idea was to go to the birth of the Indian nation and to talk about this seminal group of artists called the Progressive Artist Group. But they're so seminal. Within the dialogue of kind of Indian art history, they're kind of called the quintessential modern Indian artists. And when I first put forward the idea that this show would be just concentrating on the progressive artist group, the general attitude in the Indian art world is, why are you concentrating on a group that is already so famous? We know everything about them already. They are the quintessential Indian modernists. Surely you can have some imagination about, expanding the concept of the modern. But while I started with that position, I was quite convinced that we should actually find out who actually belonged to this group, where were they really founded, and the more questions I asked, the more I realized that even though everybody supposedly knew everything about the quintessential Indian moderns, when you came to the research, it wasn't really true. People couldn't decide when they'd actually come together. People couldn't, we didn't actually know who was the core of this group. And the fact is that there was so much conflicting information out there. So in a way, this show became a two-part thing. One was to investigate the concept of the modern and how it worked with ideas of the Indian nation, but also with internationalism. And so to investigate what modernity actually means in this context. But on the other hand, it also became quite practically about defining who were the progressive artist group, like who actually belonged to them versus the people who have been associated very closely with them. And so quite a lot of like new research came out of this. And so this is basically where I'm going to sort of start now, which is at the show itself. And the bottom section of the show, like the ground floor, really dealt with recreating the early first show from 1949 of this progressive artist group. So I'm going to give you a little bit of the spiel, which is this. At midnight on the 14th of August 1947, two countries were born, India and Pakistan. At their birth, there was a separation, as we know. And in fact, also as we know, the date of independence continues to be disputed. So as far as Pakistan is concerned, it's on the 14th. The 15th is when India celebrates it. And obviously the squabbling doesn't really end there. But so central to this national narrative of India and its development of a new Indian art was this progressive artist group. And they were founded in Bombay, now called Mumbai, but it was very much Bombay, which is a term that was used by the British. And it's seen as a very cosmopolitan term. So it's quite important that, it's always called the Bombay Progressive Artist Group. Even though their city is now technically in the national, it's referred to as Mumbai. In art history, the term Bombay continues to have that very sort of cosmopolitan resonance. And so if it was founded in Bombay in 1947, in the immediate aftermath of independence, you had 6 painters and sculptors, and this is the initial 6, okay? M.F. Husain, the one with the beard, S.H. Raza, F.N. Souza, K.H. Ara, S.K. Bakre, and H.A. Gade. And now what's so interesting about them is that they were from different castes and creeds and religious backgrounds, right? And completely different kinds of social backgrounds as well. Like some were wealthier than others. And so this was very much, the reason that they become so iconic is because it was almost felt like in the beginning of the Indian state, you had a group that really represented the very idea of the secular credentials, because they were a multi-religious, multi-caste, a kind of from different angles of society group, and so this sort of picture has become completely iconic, and this photograph itself, like if you were to ever Google the progressive artist group, this is a picture that comes up. And so in this show, I was really keen to recreate elements, as I said, of this 49 show. And so on the right, you see a Husain, and on the left, you see a Souza. So these were the two sort of very, very seminal members of this group who then go on to become extremely famous. And so these two works, I actually managed to discover where they were. And so we actually found them. And for the first time since 1949, they were reunited in New York. So this is what I wanted to talk about, sort of Prime Minister Nehru, the first Prime Minister of India, releasing the Dove of Peace. And, nationalism at this point in the sort of late 40s, 50s, 60s is very much called Nehruvian nationalism or Nehruvian secularism. And so this group becomes vital to this idea of a very plural India. And the composition of the group is already doing that. Forget about the iconography of how they develop themselves. And so the two things that I want to point out, which specifically I think Samina will come in and pick up on, is the fact that within this group, you have two Muslim artists, right? Even at its inception. And one is Husain and one is Raza. And within the mythos of a plural group, it's ironic and also quite symbolically significant that it's these two artists who become the poster boys for this group. So you have in India that is, a majority Hindu, country, but it's marketing itself on its secularism. So it's like, the whole idea is that we're not Muslim like Pakistan. We're not founded on religious identity. We're founded on secularism, and hence, because of that, it's almost like the minority community of Muslims, the sort of the Razas and the Husain, they're the ones who become the iconic symbols of that group, and also iconic symbols that in the national imagination. And so here you have Husain with a very iconic work called The Spider and the Lamp, which is all about, the lamp of enlightenment, India coming out of the dark ages to be a new free nation. And this is actually picked up and it becomes a stamp. The same thing happens to Raza, and this is his Bindu and the Earth, which is actually a 1980s painting, and this also becomes a stamp. So this is just like sort of to lay the groundwork of how iconically important this group is to the national imaginary, right? And that the benchmark of this importance are these two Muslim artists, basically. So this is just a little sneaky peek at the show as it was being set up. And so, as I said, part of the show was to discuss, who was this iconic group? Who did they actually consist of? And over here, you've got the big picture that I showed you, the photograph, which we blew up. And then on the floor, you can see a tiny little, there you are, you can see a tiny little painting. And this is actually the original 3 that formed the original 6. So in that you have Souza, Raza, and Ara. And so this is what I discovered through the research, that these were the 3 who then invited the others to join them. And as you'll see, the blow up of the picture, I said on the right is a Husain, and on the left is a Souza, and these were the 2 Husain and Souza that we discovered and reunited them for this show. And one of them, the Husain, actually belongs to a Bombay collector, and the Souza belongs to a US-based collector. And so this is the first time they'd met each other, the 2 works, in many, many years. And the 2 collectors were so excited that they decided they wanted to do a swap for 1 year. So they actually swapped the 2 paintings for a year, and they sort of shared it out between them. So it was like a nice kind of reuniting of the people involved in the show, not just the artworks itself. All right, so this is the group as we think about them in the popular imagination, right? So when people say the quintessential moderns, everybody knows everything about them. And here you have the central group of this first, the central group that is usually, when you say progressive artist group, these are the people that you think about. Now, quite ironically, the people that we think about as connected to this group, as I discovered through the research, were actually never really members of the group. They might have been close associates, but some of them were not actually even members. And so I will give you a rerun of who the group consisted of. So in the popular imagination, also constructed by the auction houses, is that anyone who can attach themselves and say, oh, we are progressive artists, start selling really well at auction. And so it becomes a kind of thing where the auction house makes a rather inclusive list of who actually belonged to the progressive artist group. So part of the show was also teasing out, who actually did and who didn't, and why is it important in the first place. So central to this group, apparently, was Husain, Raza, Ara, Souza, Akbar Padamsi, Gaitonde, Ramkumar, Taib Mehta, Christian Khanna. Less important in the popular imagination are Gade and Bakre, even though they were actually part of the first group. And there was this sort of, again, in the popular imagination, this guy called Mohan Samant, this rather famous artist who's now been rediscovered since the show. And everybody was like, no, Mohan Samant was never part of the progressive artist group. In fact, a lot of this was wrong. And so we went back to the archives, which was actually the Christian Khanna archives. And you can even see on the right here, it says Progressive Artist Group, and there are all of these names. And so this is how I built up a different narrative. So in 1949, there were 6 of them. And then many of these guys actually left. They left for foreign shores. Souza left for London. Raza left for Paris. And a new membership took over, and this was 1953. And this is when you see a new wave of people. So this is when Christian Khanna joins, this is when Gaitonde joins. And so having found this, you could actually locate who was actually in the second wave. And another thing that's often said about this progressive artist group is that they were very much an all-male club. And so the idea of the modern has always been connected to the, big bad boys of modern Indian art. And so through this research, I also discovered that even that's not true, because you have one female artist, Banu Rajapadya, who was part of the second wave of the progressives in 1953. And in fact, she was seminal to the group. Both Gaitonde and Christian Khanna were good friends of hers. So was Ara. And in fact, it was she who decided to leave, because she said, well, I'm female and I need to make my money. And I'm going to have a much better life if I do something else and not art. And she actually was the first person to make it really, really famous, because she won an Oscar in 1982. The first Indian Oscar was won by Banu, better known as Banu Attaya, for the film Gandhi. And so, a lot of things about this group and the things we've taken for granted really had to be dissected. And here you have Gaitonde, who's actually who did a painting of Banu in 1952. And here you can see that he's sort of hanging around with her. And I also wanted to show a little bit over here about, how similar their styles were at this period. So that's Gaitonde on the right, and you have Banu on the left. So, while you might say this is not a great painting, and I don't think it's that exciting, to be honest, it was not really different from what the others in the group were making at that time. It's just that she stopped being an artist and they went on to develop their style. So this was just a very quick kind of overview of how our ideas of the modern can also be contested, and kind of new research can dismantle the things that we take absolutely for granted. And it kind of, I thought it's an experience that you all at Lenbachhaus might want to share, because I realize that you all also work within a group dynamic attitude towards the Blue Rider group and the modern, and that there was a very important woman in that group as well, who in some way negotiated that whole concept of the modern and gave it a different slant. And so I discovered through the research for the show that actually the progressive artist group, this is what the truth was. So there was a core group in 1947 that was Husain, Raza, Ara, Souza, Gade, Bakre, the 6 that I showed you. And then there was a second wave in 1953 consisting of Christian Khanna, Gaitonde, Mohan Samant actually belonged to the group, Banu, Attaya. And then there were these very close associates who often get tarred with exactly the same brush, but they were associates rather than actually card-carrying members of the group. And that's Akbar Padamsi, Ram Kumar, and Taib Mehta. So now we're going into a little bit about how we're defining the whole notion of the progress, why they chose this word, and how it intersects with the notion of the modern. And I'm going to go quite quickly through this bit so that I can get to some of the meat. So one of the 3 things that we're going to look at, and one is look left, the other is look east, and then finally it's look west. And as you'll see, as we debate ideas of progress and modern, we also are debating what constitutes what constitutes Indian modernity and how does it actually intersect with international modernism. And so in some ways, the way we come up with this step, with this sort of, in some ways, the way we come up with the definition of the Indian modern is also about how we talk about modernism per se. And there's been lots of conversations recently about, how they're alternative modernisms. And one of the things that the show was trying to contest is that very word, alternative modernism. It was trying to show through the build-up of images that in fact modernism at source is always hybrid, and the reason that you can see similarities between the progressive artist group and with the group that Samina is talking about, which is the Lahore Art Circle, as well as with the sort of Picasso and the kind of international moderns, is because this was a dialogue that they were borrowing from each other and each other's sort of cultural trajectories. So it's not that they're alternative modernisms, it's that modernism itself is alternative. It's hybrid even within itself. So quickly, if we're looking left, what I mean by left here is that the progressive artists group chose the term progressive because it was very much in the air. And why was it in the air? Because it was a term that throughout the 40s and the early 50s was being used in the cultural sphere. And partly because the term progressive was connected with a very Marxist agenda, a left agenda. However, even as, the Progressive Artist Group, the first exhibition in 1949, was opened by somebody called Mulk Raj Anand, and he was a writer, a very famous writer for the Progressive Writers Association. And so the terminology of the Progressive Artist Group was buying into this larger rubric of progress. But even while it was doing that, you had Souza, who was very much a spokesperson for the group, and he's a beautiful writer, publishes this article, which you see before you, called What Makes Progressive Art. And so even as the show is launching itself, the entire article is a diatribe against the word progress. And he talks about the fact, why are we calling ourselves Progressive Artist Group? This is all rubbish. This is too left-leaning. And he was like, the left doesn't really understand modern art, and I feel that the terminology of the progressive is just too left for what we're trying to do. And what we are as modern, we're not progressive in this sense. However, even as, and this is quite typical Souza, even as he's writing this diatribe against the very name that he's given this group, he signs off as secretary of the Progressive Artist Group. So this inbuilt contradiction is already part of the group, of what is progress, what does the progressive actually stand for. And so there's that element. And then the other thing that I wanted to talk about is that, very often the myth of the modern and the myth of progress, and the way these two words are combined, is that you have an ideology that is about the new, and certainly Souza talked about the mythology of the modern in those terms. And one thing to remember is that this was a very plural group, not just in the way it was composed of very different kinds of personalities, but it was also plural in the sense that increasing this stylistically, particularly where they ended up, was very different. And while there's a huge mythology about the Progressive Artist Group as being seminal to the idea of the Indian modern, in fact, it lasted for a very short time. So if the first lot founded themselves in 1949, and then they were joined by a second lot in 53, many of the seminal founders like Souza, Raza, had already dispersed. It already got off to foreign shores by the time the 1953 exhibition happened, and even that was only a short wind of a group. So they had that exhibition in 53, and that was their first and last exhibition. And the group had sort of unofficially dissolved by 56. So it was a really, really short-lived group. And a lot of its members, Souza, Raza, Husain in particular, and Ara, go off to very much have their own careers and be very famous in their own right as individual artists. So there wasn't so much of a group identity, I guess, much like Kandinsky in a way. These guys had their own kind of trajectory. And one of the things that Souza, when he was building the myth about Souza, talked about is that how his art was a complete break from the past. So he said there were two things that this group was fighting against. And one was the crappy Bengal school, which was full of sentimental pictures. I think Samina will bring them up as well. And the other thing was British academic style painting, realist painting. However, what I would like to show you is the fact that, even though the modern is filled with this kind of idea that is a break from the past and like out with the old and in with the new, in fact, if you look at the early composition of the visuals, this isn't wholly true. So it wasn't that they completely threw out tradition. It's the fact that, not just were they looking towards the West for a modern dialogue, they were also looking to a South Asian past. And so when Samina talks about her group, there's one thing that I think that you all should try and compare is the fact that, in fact, that both of these guys, both of these sort of very progressive modern movements were actually looking at very similar things. And what were the similar things? They were looking east, they were looking at South Asia's own past. So even in constructing their new language, they were also looking at a South Asian past. And that also fed into that construction of the visual. So here you have a Gaitonde who is usually very, very famous for his abstract work, but this is an early Gaitonde, and you can see to what extent it's influenced by traditional Pahari painting. Now, Pahari painting had its sort of it's a form of the Punjab hills, and it's what you have to know about it is that it's quite a traditional form. And so it's interesting that despite the fact that they were talking about out with the old, in with the new, this is the kind of work they were looking at, and their early iconography definitely drew from it. The other thing being that Jagannath Ahivasi, Professor Ahivasi, was their teacher at the JJ School of Art, and he was very, very big on Pahari painting, as you can see from the development of his style. And so this was their early influence. So despite the mythology of the modern having nothing to do with the old, they were looking towards the East, and they were looking towards their own tradition. And here you see Husain. Again, he's looking towards Hindu mythology. So this is a Hindu, the god Hanuman, who's carrying the mountain. And very often Hanuman in Husain's iconography becomes a symbol, a rebel figure, a symbol of freedom. And here you have him in an early painting called Yatra. I'm now going to give you a little bit so that Samina can pick up on this later on, and talk to you about this whole notion that, these particular Indian moderns wanted to build on the idea of secularism, right? I told you, and this sort of multi-religious past. Even when they were looking at the past, it's quite interesting that even when there were Muslim artists like Husain or Raza, they were not looking at the Mughal past, which is usually associated with a, elegiac Muslim past. If they were looking at the past, they were looking at things like this. So Husain says, I was influenced by the Expressionists, but I was also looking at Gupta period sculpture, which is like ancient Indian Gupta sculpture. So Hindu period sculpture, a Bashali period, so Pahari painting. Bashali is a kind of Pahari, falls under that school. And these were the things that he was influenced by. And I just wanted to give you this quote. And so with the Bashali or the Pahari painting style, as I said, it's not an elegiac Muslim style. It's an inherently syncretic style that comes out of the Mughal period, and it becomes something very other because it absorbs Hindu influences and local influences and folk traditions. So it's very interesting that these guys, when they're constructing their language of the new and they're borrowing from an Indian tradition or South Asian tradition, what they're looking at is the most syncretic aspects of that tradition. And also, I thought this quote was very funny and interesting because it's Husain showing off about the fact that, Souza looks at his work and he says, Hussein, what have you discovered? Have you discovered something new? Why does your work look like that? And his point is that he has discovered something new. What he's discovered is the ancient Indian past, and that's what he's drawing on to construct his new language. And so in the Asia Society show, what I insisted that we do is that we take elements of traditional South Asian painting, fine art traditions, and compare it with the moderns. And this is to create a different kind of dialogue for the Indian moderns. And one of the reasons for this is that because both Husain and Souza are usually in the West, they're highly castigated for being very derivative. So Husain and Souza are usually called the Indian Picassos. Somebody like a Gaitonde is called the Indian Mark Rothko. And my dialogue was that, hey, look, if you're looking at the modern, the modern is always borrowing from other ancient traditions. And in this case, we already know that, they're influenced by the West, but you also have to admit that they had another stream of influence. And what was the stream of influence? It was their own past, and this is what they were. This was part of their construction of the modern. And then I just wanted to, very quickly, I think the point here was saying that, the reason that we might see that the Lahore Art Circle and the Progressive Artist Group have a similar kind of iconography in the 50s is because actually they were looking at the same things. They were looking at the West, but they were also looking at a similar sort of South Asian tradition. But as Samina will tell you, that with the Lahore Art Circle, they were not so obsessed with the idea of a secular nationalism. That wasn't really where they were coming from. Whereas I think this early period, the Progressive Artist Group, that is what they were constructing for themselves. Because for both Raza and Souza, it was a choice that they didn't go to Pakistan. It was a choice that they wanted to define themselves as Indian. However, there's a similarity, as you can see. This is Ali Imam, Raza's brother, and Samina will come back and talk about it, so I am just not going to focus on this. But now we're going to look west, right? So what is other things that they were influenced by? A whole lot of this group, as I said, also went to Paris, and they went to France, and this is another part of their definition of the modern, is the international modern. And in the sort of a close associate of the Progressive Artist Group was Ram Kumar, and he studied with André Lott, who's a Cubist painter who Samina will also talk about because he was equally influential on members of the Lahore Art Circle. And so I just wanted to show you Ram Kumar, the city, and Shakir Ali, woman in wool, and you can see the influence of André Lott. So this was the looking west aspect of their career. Here was Souza, who also goes off, Souza in 49, he leaves for London, but he goes on a journey with his modern artist friends like Raza and Akbar Padamsi, and they go all over France, and you can see the similarity in the iconography, right? So you have Souza's red landscape. Now this is Akbar Padamsi rooftop. So throughout the 50s, they're looking at a similar kind of quite Cézanne-esque landscape. And this is the kind of work that they're painting together. And this is Ali Imam, who's Raza's brother, and similar sort of blocky style. So even though, different side of the border, you have a similar kind of reference point. And this is Raza. And if you remember this image, it's going to be really, really important because Samina is doing something very exciting with what Raza's brother does with this. But this is Raza's black sun over here. And this is Raza and his brother. And again, in the show, what I wanted to again draw attention to was this. There was this juxtaposition. So, as I said, if Husain was looking at the deep Indian past, or the South Asian past, so was Raza doing that. And Raza goes increasingly abstract. And so even though he leaves for France and, he wins a French art prize in 1956, and he's very much defining himself as a French artist in that landscape tradition. But by the 80s, he's already talking about coming home, and the bindu is something that that appears in his iconography, and the bindu is also known as the black. It's known as a primal seed. So his black sun in the French paintings turns into the primal seed. And Raza talks about the bindu being a sign of his homecoming to India. And the things that he's looking at are Rajasthani paintings. So we contrasted it with the Rajasthani painting and the hot colors of Madhya Pradesh, which was his home state, as well as Rajasthan. And you can see that this was an image that I had in the show. And this is what I juxtaposed it with. And you can see the similarities and the kind of colors that were being drawn upon. And Raza is a rather interesting character because when he dies, I'm not going to go into this because this is a whole different dialogue about, the modern Indian art and Husain and censorship and what happens to Husain. But suffice it to say that Husain runs into deep trouble with the Hindu right towards the 80s. But Raza, on the other hand, becomes sort of an iconic symbol of the secular Indian, and a lot of his imagery draws deeply from Tantra, from Hindu mythology, and this is always seen as his iconic painting, Ma. And what does Ma mean? It means mother. And at the bottom of the work, you can see the Devanagari text, and what it says is, "Mother, when I come home, what shall I bring you?" And of course, this is seen as the sign that Raza is coming home to India, and he is Indian, and this is his eternal return, as it were. And this is very much how he defines himself. And what's so interesting is that with Raza, you have, even as the Hindu right grows in power in India, Raza never falls out of favor. So he's loved both by the right and by the left and by the liberals. And so when he dies, Husain dies in exile, saying, "I'm an Indian artist, that is all." But he dies in exile and as a citizen of Qatar, whereas Raza dies in Delhi. And this is what is said about him, that he's a huge loss to the art world, and that, his work represented an uncontested version of secularism. But what's so interesting in this dialogue, and this is now where I'm going to end, really, is the fact that as far as Raza is concerned, he's so deeply embedded in a kind of Hindu tantric past that he's only read in this way. But now I want to suggest to you, and this is where we kind of come into a different sort of dialogue, is that where after this show was over and I'd stopped highlighting the sort of secular Indian elements of this of these particular group of artists, I met Samina, and what we started to investigate together was to what extent there were crossovers visually, stylistically, and how many gaps there were in the dialogue, even about the progressive artist group, and the fact that actually they had quite a lot of involvement in Pakistan. So while in India they become, quintessential secular Indian artists, the interactions they had with a Muslim Pakistan, inverted commas, are totally ignored and overridden. And it's only now with cross-border kind of art historical dialogues with like me and Samina that we can actually reconstruct this and go back to it and look again at our ideas of the nation and the modern and say, maybe we only have half the story and not the whole one. And so while Raza is always read through this very Hindu tantric frame, perhaps we can talk about the fact that, there are other ways that you can also read his iconography. And so, yes, it's about the Tibetan mandala, it's about the sort of tantric tradition, but it could also be about Islamic geometry. That could also be why that Bindu develops in that way. And similarly, if you look at the other progressive artist group, members, Souza, in the 70s, Souza has a great career in London in the 60s. By 66, he's persona non grata. He goes to New York, and that is probably his worst career move. He's not accepted. And so who is it that actually rehabilitates him? Ironically enough, he comes to Raza's brother in Karachi, and Samina will talk a little bit about that gallery. And he's completely rehabilitated. So the 70s paintings that Souza does are actually like this white mosque, are something that we've discovered on the walls of a Pakistani art collector living in London, who kind of has these juxtapositions where you can actually construct both kinds of Indian and Pakistani moderns and see how far they have influenced each other. And this is because Souza was in Karachi in the 70s, and a lot of his work was collected there, something that I didn't even know because of the dialogue that I'm used to in an Indian art context. And of course, this is now really where I'm going to end, which is that another thing that we can start looking at is the partition itself. And I'm going to like whiz through this and say that, this is probably the time at which we have enough distance from it to actually deal with how the normal narrative is that the Indian moderns and the Pakistani moderns never really dealt with partition in their work at all. And so there's a big blind spot about it that was never addressed. And I think even this is something that we can contest and possibly re-look at the images and rediscover, hidden paintings and talk about the fact that actually it was a structuring principle in their work, and how can we look at it again? And so to conclude, in the light of everything that I've sort of tried to squash into this half an hour period, so there are three things that I think we can learn from the progressive artist group and the particular idea of the group dynamic, which is kind of what you guys are investigating as well. The first is a national question. And the fact that the progressives have, for instance, had such a huge idea within the national imaginary, but there's a separation between what art history has said so far about them as a kind of quintessential Indian modern and fact. And if they are seen as secular heroes, what does Samina's group actually teach us about the Indian progressives and about the nature of the modern? And how do we get away from this narrow sort of nationalistic definition that we've been here to sort of like giving them? And then also the idea of the international modern, the fact that so many of all of these two groups travel to foreign shores. And so what did that add to the concept both of the nation, but as well as what did it add to the concept of the modern itself? And then finally, the fact that they belong to a group and that they're very highly individualistic members of a group identity that then fragments so quickly. In fact, does each one have a different kind of investment in both the national and the international and the modern? And what does that actually teach us about the way groups function? And lastly, by comparing these two groups, how do we deal with the other and the self? The fact that the very notion of the progressives was actually in the light of partition. And so there was always a Muslim other that they had to deal with in the case of Pakistan. And I would argue that even Samina's group, perhaps we can say that there was always a secular India that they had to deal with. And so that's where I'm going to end and introduce Samina. Samina, how do I
Hi.
stop the screen share?
Yes.
And
the screen share has stopped.
Okay. And can you do yours? And this is me trying to introduce you from okay. So, Dr. Samina Iqbal is a practicing artist, art historian, and an academic. She received her BFA from the National College of Arts, Lahore, in 1997, her MFA from the University of Minnesota in 2003, and a PhD in art historical studies from the Virginia Commonwealth University, Richmond, in 2016. Her research focuses on the study of the modern art in Pakistan in the first decade of its establishment through a small group of artists in a collective called the Lahore Art Circle. She's currently working on extending her research by undertaking a comparative study of what modern art entailed for other neighboring countries of Pakistan, including the Mensa region, while examining the respective purposefully open-ended dialectical tensions between international, national, and local stylistic concerns of the region, a parallel dialogue to the Western canon. Dr. Samina is currently an assistant professor at the Lahore School of Economics in Pakistan.
Thank you, Zehra. So I am going to, thank you so much, Zehra, for the introduction. So I will start my screen share, and I just have to say a few words again, thanking Lenbachhaus Museum for letting us do this on their platform. So, Zehra, can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So, Zehra already has done heavy lifting of, working on the context of the formation of Pakistan and the partition of Pakistan. So, I mean, luckily I don't have to go over that. And following up on her presentation, I present a parallel modern art movement in the newly established Pakistan via a small group of artists called Lahore Art Circle, founded in 1952. In this presentation, I will first establish the condition that led to the founding of Lahore Art Circle, and then I posit that Lahore Art Circle saw itself parallel to the influential avant-garde Bombay progressive artist group that Zehra just presented, and I argue that it was modeled after it. I proceed to define what modern art meant for Lahore Art Circle, and last but not least, establish the cross connections between the two collectives and how they were similar and different from each other simultaneously. Indeed, the formative years of modern art in Pakistan, and my focus specifically is 1947 to 57, were centered in Lahore, with the Park Tea House and Coffee House on Mall Road as vibrant focal points of intellectual discussions and natural meeting places for writers, poets, and artists. So these are the places which is really the crux of the places where the dialogue is happening. It's a really small cafe located on Lahore Mall Road, and it is actually really few feet away from Mayo School of Art, which we inherited at the time of partition in 1947. It is within this scene that Shakir Ali makes an entry to the artistic and intellectual scene of Lahore, returning from Prague from the Czech Republic and joining the Mayo School of Arts Lahore as a faculty member. Being the first Pakistani artist trained in the West, he quickly becomes the center of attention for the young, energetic artist of Lahore. So a little bit I want to say about Shakir Ali is that, he's somebody who comes to Pakistan in 1951, and he is, and his age is right at that time is 31 years old. So his decision to take up Pakistani citizenship is very deliberate. And the idea that I'm really trying to emphasize here is, so Shakir Ali was born in Rampur, North India in 1916. So for him to take the Pakistani citizenship is a very deliberate decision that he picks up on. So initially with the 5 young artists, including Sheikh Safdar Ali, and you're seeing the picture on the screen. Muin Najmi, Anwar Jalal Shamza, Sayyid Ali Imam, who is the brother of Bombay progressive artist Sayyid Haider Raza that Zehra just talked about. Shakir Ali founded this group. Ahmed Parvez is also a member. And then we have two women artists, Razia Feroz and Mariam Shah, who also joined the group a few months later. So Safdar Mir, one of the professors of English literature at Government College Lahore, brilliantly captures the condition that led to the founding of Lahore Art Circle. He states, and I quote, Shakir Ali joined the Muse School of Art and what is more important, came across a small group of very young and very violent enthusiasts of painting. These young painters had similar problems and a similar attitude towards their solutions. They're all iconoclasts, individualists, and breakers of traditions, mad. They were young, they believed in doing whatever they pleased. New experiences and an expanded scope had come their way. A new nation was trying to forge itself into unity to face the challenges of freedom. End quote. I'm going to try to get rid of this green margin. Zehra, are you seeing that green margin?
No, I'm not seeing any green margin.
Okay, great. All right. So I want to mention here that all of the Lahore Art Circle members were earlier, what I mean is before partition, practicing artists in the prevalent styles, including European nationalism, Bengal school style, and so on. So elsewhere, Safdar Mir says, again, he says that the young Pakistani artists felt that they had inherited from their past was too static, smug, non-violent, and vegetarian. Colors washed too often and gave an impression of bleaching. The lines melodious, sugary, cloying, velvety, flowing, and metaphysically inane. The art of painting expressed none of the conflicts and tensions of a vigorous community facing the challenges of the post-war world. End quote. What I'm trying to establish here is that, there is this tension already present at the independence of Pakistan, that, what we had inherited was not something that this young group wanted to stick with. So what you're looking at is, like I am showing you a slide of the prevalent trends in Pakistan that's happening at the time of partition. So that, one can understand that the young artists considered these prevalent practices stale and static because they were either confined to mimetic representations or romantic and allegorical views of the glorious past of Muslims that was limited and could not address a wider audience across the globe. Furthermore, the idea of producing art of pretty pictures in the traditional painting practice during such a time of chaos, unrest, and anxiety for the future must have seemed out of place and unreal for them. The real task was not to recall the past, but to move the art practices in Pakistan towards a progressive direction compatible with the rest of the world. So what you're seeing on the screen is a few examples of the artists that were working in Lahore. And because my locus and my is, talking about this small artist collective, Lahore Art Circle, which is a small city, not a small city, it's a metropolitan city of Pakistan, a cultural hub. So what you're looking at on the screen, on the left side, Haji Sharif is somebody who works in miniature painting, traditional miniature painting, also teaches at Muse School of Art, which was the only art institute that we inherited at the time of partition. And there was also this Department of Fine Arts in Punjab University, but that was really a small department. Muse School of Art was one of the four projects of colonial times, which was really established to encourage the craftsmanship in this part of the world. You're looking at Allah Bakhsh in the middle, who's also called as Ustad Allah Bakhsh, a teacher teaching at Muse School of Art. The word Ustad meant somebody who is expert in his work, but not a fine artist. Faizi Rahmeen is an artist on your extreme right on the top, who migrated from from Delhi to Karachi and was established in Karachi so that he can really foster an artistic scene in Karachi. Chughtai, you're seeing on the left bottom, who is really somebody who was very well established in at the time of partition. He was 51 years old then, and he was this towering figure, which sort of like unspokenly became the national artist of Pakistan, really embracing the idea of like past glorious Muslim, the past glorious past of Muslims, really embracing the miniature painting, but in a very, very innovative way of like combining it with Art Nouveau. You're looking at Anna Molka's work on the extreme right at the bottom, where this is a woman who's a woman artist who migrates from England to India in late 30s. She takes over the position of a chair of the Department of Fine Art in Punjab University. And she's somebody who's painting in this post-impressionist style. Social realist themes is her idea. So this is just really to kind of give you a taste of what is really happening and where is that, these artists, these Lahore Art Circle would really kind of like, deviate from this. As Zehra mentions, that a crucial time when India was just liberated from colonial rule and separated into two nations of India and Pakistan, Bombay Progressive Art Circle is redefining Indian modernism in its own term and in dialogue with the movement of international modernism. And similar was the intention of the Lahore Art Circle. And I want to show you a few slides. And just for the sake of time, I tried to like put a lot of these slides together. So these are the artists that I already familiarized you, like, the 6 founding members, and then the 2 women artists also joins in. So you're looking at the works of these artists from 1950s and, late 50s. And so when you're looking at these works, I just want to mention that, this is happening under all of Shakir Ali's mentorship. And I cannot emphasize enough on the importance of Shakir Ali as the artist, because one is that, he is the leading member of this small collective, one who has moved from Czech Republic to Pakistan, deliberately taking the citizenship of Pakistan, who has studied in Slade School of Fine Arts. He has also studied under Andre Lotz. And he becomes this liminal figure who's really a connection of the colonial past to the post-colonial society, the way he brings the work. And I also want to mention that he's somebody who was already trained in traditional painting of Bengal school style. He was also trained in European academic style. But then, when he comes back to Pakistan, he's bringing something completely new to the country. So Lahore Art Circle deviated from the traditional practices of miniature painting, European nationalism, and Bengal school style to incorporate a range of stylistic elements of modernist movements such as post-impressionism, abstraction, cubism, and gestalt into their practices to establish a modern idiom grounded in South Asia. For them, modern was to embrace the international art scene and engage with it, and yet retain the aesthetics of their identity within the newly formed nation of Pakistan. However, unlike Bombay Progressive, Lahore Art Circle members were not from different religions. How Zehra mentioned that, they all came together from 6 different, sects and, different kinds of religious backgrounds. Lahore Art Circle members are all from the same, background. They're all Muslims. Some of them had migrated from India, like Ali Imam, who's Sayyid Ali Imam, who's brother of Sayyid Haider Raza. By the way, Sayyid Ali Imam is the younger one. There's Anwar Jalal Shamza, and then there is also Sheikh Safdar Ali, who migrated, and of course Shakir Ali, as I mentioned earlier, who felt forced to leave India. So for him, for Shakir Ali to coming to Pakistan with his free choice, for his free will, is very different from all these other artists who are like really compelled to leave India in very difficult circumstances. So Lahore Art Circle members, the picture that you are seeing on the screen is with the Sheikh Safdar Ali is right here, one of the members of Lahore Art Circle, who was a very active member of the set designer team at Bombay Talkies. And this is a picture from, pre-partition. So Lahore Art Circle members were also not interested in pronouncing a nation-state agenda or pronouncing themselves as secular like Bombay Progressive. Instead, they precariously managed to establish themselves not being part of nationalistic rhetoric, but at the same time not defying the formation of Pakistan. And I'll come back to it if time allows towards the end. I say that because detailed study of their work will show the kind of secular approach in their work. For instance, they were painting nudes and all kinds of experimental work that, I just gave you a glimpse of, these things, which is really not like settling with the nationalist agenda. So I come back to also the crossovers between the two groups. Of the collectives, the friendships and the familial relationships of the two collectives must have also played a role in the formation of this group. So the picture that you're seeing on the screen is Sayyid Ali Imam and Sayyid Haider Raza. On the left is Sayyid Ali Imam, who's the younger brother of Sayyid Haider Raza, as I mentioned before. At the time of partition, Sayyid Ali Imam left for Pakistan. He was actually forced by his family to move to Pakistan. However, Sayyid Haider Raza chose to move to Paris instead of coming to Pakistan. And the number of interviews that I have conducted with Sayyid Ali Imam's family was that Sayyid Haider Raza really was not happy with Sayyid Ali Imam taking off to Pakistan. He just didn't like the idea that, it would just break the, family in that sense. So besides the most obvious shared socio-political backgrounds and post-colonialism, there are several commonalities and differences between the two groups because of the cross connections between the members. So the one that I just mentioned is, the two brothers, real brothers in two different, across border in two different artist collectives. So Sayyid Safdar and Shamsa and Ali Imam, when they migrated to Lahore at the time of the partition, they shared educational institutions such as Safdar Ali Imam took part-time classes at JJ School of Art, and they also were part of collectives like, Sheikh Safdar Ali was friends with MF Husain, that Zehra mentions in her Bombay Progressives group, while they were both working for Bombay Talkies. And then remember, I just showed you a picture of Sheikh Safdar Ali also working for Bombay Talkies. They were all designing film sets in the city. They were also part of the Muslim Sketch Club between 1944 to 46. This was also a small group that they had founded as Muslim members. It is very well possible that Safdar was able to remind his fellows of Lahore Art Circle members of the great benefits of the group solidarity and shared goals. In addition, Shakir Ali's time in Paris under André Lotte, where Padamsee and Ram Kumar also studied, must have crossed paths there. And let's not forget about the relationship of Sayyid Haider Ali and Ali Imam that I have on the screen with each other. And they remained in touch with each other after the establishment of the two countries via letters, postcards, and phone calls, yet remained committed to fashioning the modern art of their respective nations. The relationship of the two brothers is not a well-known fact in Pakistan. So it's really recently that, through my research and other scholars who have really started to highlight this very interesting connection of Sayyid Ali Imam and Sayyid Haider Raza, that, they were both brothers, talking on the phones and, always, taking, making sure that they're keeping, connecting. However, Ali Imam briefly studied at JJ School of Arts following his brother's footstep and was aware of the founding of Bombay Progressives, which his elder brother was the founding member of. The two brothers, interestingly, never exchanged any ideas or conversed about the possibility of showing works with each other in each other's chosen countries. So I just wanted to emphasize that. And I wanted to show you that, the kind of conversations that were happening between them. So when you're looking at this card, which I kind of retyped on the side so you could read it, and I highlighted this orange part where he's just in the beginning, at the end, he's talking about asking after each other's, well-being and all that. But then, in this orange, you could read. So this is a letter that, a postcard that Sayyid Haider Raza is sending to Ali Imam. And he's saying, "My paintings are at last back from Germany. Recently, Mr. Jacques Lazin visited the studio and liked the work. For the first time, I had my best paintings available. He's writing a study for, I think this is a magazine name, to be published in March. The paintings will leave again for Canada next month. So now the task will be the next Paris exhibition. So, it kind of shows that he shares what he's doing. However, he's really not interested in offering each other the chance to show. And I mention this especially because Sayyid Ali Imam is somebody who comes back from London in late 60s, and he establishes a gallery really well known in Karachi, which was called as Indus Gallery, where Souza and M.F. Husain exhibited their works in late 70s. However, Raza's work was never shown at the library. According to Ali Imam's widow, the two brothers cared for each other, and she calls, and I quote her, Bhaijan, which is Raza, calls and wrote to Ali Imam regularly. But strange enough that they never asked about Imam's work. He would never ask what you're doing or how's your work going. The telephonic conversation would merely be limited to asking after Ali's two children and wife, and that would be it. The list goes on, and as Zehra mentions that, F. and Souza, M.F. Husain's friendship with Ali Imam in London, which culminated to their visits to Pakistan in 1970s and exhibiting their works at Ali Imam's gallery, which was called as Indus Gallery, I mentioned just a minute ago. This indicates that they must have been in contact with each other in yesteryears. And as Zehra established, that Bombay Progressive was structured and organized group with a clear manifesto, which was to project themselves as a member of a secular India, arguably in line with India's state agenda, turning towards Lahore Art Circle, which was founded 5 years later than Bombay Progressive Artists, was also an organized and first of its kind group. Although unlike Bombay Progressive, there was no formal manifesto discovered for the Lahore Art Circle as yet. But I was able to find one of the meeting minutes of Lahore Art Circle, and I will come back.
Please go back to that one, yeah.
I will come back to it in just a minute. I just wanted to mention this meeting minutes, and I'll come back to Ali Imam and Heather Raza's work, which has uncanny resemblance to each other. So what I have discovered are these meeting minutes, on the basis of which I established that, the Lahore Art Circle was a well-organized group with ambitions and goals similar to Bombay Progressives. For example, the many meeting minutes show that Lahore Art Circle held regular meetings in which they discussed and planned future strategies to push the group forward into the mainstream international art scene. Lahore Art Circle members also promoted themselves as secular but did not become part of the nation-state agendas. The group held 5 important exhibitions under the banner of Lahore Art Circle, showed their work in groups of 2, 3, 6, and occasionally solo exhibitions. So the first exhibition of Lahore Art Circle was a 2-person show in 1953 by Anwar Jalal Shamsa and Sheikh Sattar Ali, which was held in Murray. The second was a 3-person show. I'm just sharing few of the pictures of their exhibition and their exhibition brochures. The third exhibition was held in Lahore, and you're seeing the catalog for that, in which 6 artists exhibited their work, including Anwar Jalal Shamsa, Mariam Shah, Muin Najmi, Razia Feroz, Sheikh Sattar Ali, and Sayyid Ali Imam. The fourth show was the solo exhibition of Razia Feroz, which I don't have the picture yet, but then, there was another exhibition held in Lahore at the same time. So the Lahore Art Circle was active between 1952 to 58, and several other young artists later joined the group. The first secretary of Lahore Art Circle was Salim Shahid. Between 1955 to 58, just like Bombay Progressives started to disperse, Lahore Art Circle members also started to make their way west for higher education and other lucrative opportunities to promote. Their art in Europe, except for Shakir Ali and Sheikh Sattar Ali, who stayed back in Pakistan, contributing to the development of the art in Pakistan. The 3 who went to London included Sayyid Ali Imam, Ahmed Pervez, and Shamsa. And then they formed, interestingly, another artist group in London, which was called as Pakistan Group London in 1958. So I'm going to take a stop here, and I want to go back for a second, and then I'll probably just wind up my talk here. I just wanted to show you a picture of Sayyid Ali Imam's work, which is on the left side. Unfortunately, I was not able to find a color version of this image. And then you're looking at on the right is Sayyid Haider Raza, which is a member of Bombay Progressives. And this is a color image of that. And if you look at these, I mean, it's just amazing how the work has these similarities between them. Again, looking at these, structures and these abstract, way of drawing the homelands. And I wonder, if they were looking at each other's work at all, because to my knowledge, there wasn't anything in terms of connecting, as I established when I was showing you the letters and the postcards that, and it is not that time where the news will travel because of the internet so quickly that, they would be able to see, what the other partner, the brother, or the members are doing in the, international art scene. But this is something that I'm very intrigued with, and this is something that Zehra and I'm also building on, looking at these, finding these connections, how uncanny is that, both of them are, making works which has such kind of resemblances that they're working on. So what I want to conclude my talk would be that I propose that based on such similarities and differences, a close analysis of the two collectives will be critical to understanding the formation and visions of what modern art in the two countries entailed, and to study the crossovers between the collectives that were direct influences on the two. Thus, modern art in the context of Indian subcontinent is complex but pivotal in shaping the social fabric of the two nation states. And what I would also argue towards the end of it is that, the modern art that the Lahore Art Circle followed was something that, I call is heuristic modernism, which was really based on the idea of trial and error, which was really based on the idea of experimentation. I also want to pick up on where Zehra talked about, the idea that, these artists are also looking inwards, towards the East. So naturally, Shamsa being trained in Bengal school style, Ahmed Parvez being trained in European academic style by one of his uncle, they have all these prior knowledge already. And, they are taking away from that path. But somehow it is not possible to really kind of completely detach oneself and move somewhere else. Shakir Ali, same case, he's somebody who's trained in Bengal school style, who has this, developed aesthetics of Ajanta cave paintings and Ellora. And, so when you look at these work, and because the time is so short here, we couldn't really analyze the works in detail. All of these things connect to the kind of, particular sort of connectivity with the past, but then also their wish to really leave behind that colonial past, not following that kind of traditional things. And I think for these progressive artists on both sides, the idea of really carrying on these mimetic representation or pretty picture is not something that they're interested in. So their experimentation and entanglement with the international modern art movements is something to really kind of re-examine and re-study. So I'm going to end my conversation here, and I will stop this screen share. And now that Zehra and I both are on the screen here, we would like to both, Zehra, maybe you should take over and thank the museum organizers. And what would you like to, how would you like to end it?
Yeah, so I thought what we'd say is that, we'd like to thank you very much, and we hope that you actually, as you think about your exhibition, sort of build up, sort of conversations that we could also sort of learn more about how you guys are looking at ideas of the collective. And something that I found really fascinating, which I was telling Samina about, was the way in which your Blue Rider group is hung even now, and the kind of juxtapositions you all do with sort of Bavarian folk culture. And I even found like a Hindu goddess glass painting that you all have displayed alongside some of the Blue Rider works. And it would be very fascinating to see, some of the other presentations in this series that you've put together, so that we can have a sort of contrast of how the modern is sort of developed in different places, but also, perhaps perhaps they also sort of share commonalities, and the sort of the tension between the national and international, and at the same time with the modern there's always the idea of the universal. How do these things relate to each other, and how do they hold their tension, and also how does a group dynamic affect these themes? Is there something that we can learn from a group that we wouldn't be able to if we were just taking any one of these elements out and looking at them as great modern artists? And so some of those things, right?
Thank you, Zehra. And I just want to say one last thing is that we understand that, within these 30, 40 minutes, we probably might have left a lot of gaps, and we would be very happy to collaborate and, maybe do a Zoom session where if the people can send us questions, we would be happy to answer those. And a lot of these gaps, we are very aware of it. We can just fill them in during a Q&A thing. And I thank you again, everyone, for looking at this or listening to this lecture, and we take off from here. Thank you so much. Bye from Lahore, and Zehra.
Bye from London. Well, not London, Wales.
All right. Thank you.